Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. Is it a little warm in here? A little hot? It's always hotter up here than it is down there, obviously. Well, maybe that's not obvious. I don't know. But it's funny. You should try going in the balcony. It's really warm up there. Sure is good to see everybody here this morning. It certainly is good to be here, as always. We're going to be continuing our study in the book of Joshua. And so if you want to open to chapter 10, you're welcome to do so. The passages will be on the screen as usual. But if you want to follow along in your own Bible, that would be a good thing to do as well. You ever heard the phrase, and I'm sure you have, it's a pretty familiar phrase, but it's no good deed goes, what? Unpunished, right? There are phrases like that. I think, of course that's not always true, but there are phrases like that we use and we have because, well, we've had experiences like that, and they become common phrases because we've had these kinds of experience where it seems like sometimes that is true, because it's very relatable that there are times when you try to do something good, you have good intentions and good thoughts about something, or a good plan for something, or you think you're doing something good and it really just comes back and it bites you. And we've all experienced that, to where phrases like that become very relatable. But on the same hand, we've also had many times when we have done things and we have seen great reward from it, that the opposite of that phrase is true, that there are lots of times when we do good and good things come from that. And so we recognize that as well, but there are many times when it does seemingly backfire. And it's always those times when it backfires on us that are the most memorable. I don't know why that is. It's always that one time that you did something and things kind of came back to bite you, and that one moment just sticks with you, and it almost causes you to hesitate to want to do something good for someone again. We've had that experience. We understand what that feels like. But what really is puzzling to us, and what is really strange, and it just causes us to scratch our head and just think, I don't understand how life works this way. What really is puzzling to us is when good deeds are returned with some kind of punishment. And you just really are puzzled by that, and you just can't really wrap your head around the logic behind a good deed being returned with punishment. And it's really hard to think about that. Or even the idea of somebody doing something wrong, a bad deed being rewarded. And it just really makes you want to throw your hands up in the air and think, I don't understand how this thing works anymore, because we witness things like that, and you try to make sense out of it, and it doesn't always make sense. It's confusing and it's complicated. But these kinds of experiences really remind us of the fact that the response, the result of an action doesn't necessarily determine whether that action was good or whether that action was bad. In a perfect world, maybe it would. Maybe in a perfect world that we would be able to determine whether something is good or something was bad, whether a behavior was good or a behavior was bad, strictly on the results, strictly on the outcome. That every good thing would result in a good outcome, and every bad thing would result in a bad outcome. If that's the way the world worked 100% of the time, you could use those experiences and determine what is good and what is bad. The thing is, in the world that we live in, it doesn't always work that way. That sometimes good things are treated bad. Sometimes good actions are punished. And sometimes bad actions are rewarded. And since we live in that kind of world, we become very skeptical of things, but we also find it difficult to determine what things are good and what things are bad. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be unpacking this idea of things that we may do, and they may have results. They may be good things. They may be things that we thought were good choices that we thought we make, and they come back and they bite us. But on the same hand, because of that, we have this temptation to respond in a certain way, right? To bring about a desired outcome, to make things balance, to correct things. And so we're going to be unpacking this idea, but we're in Joshua right now, and we're going to be talking about Joshua chapter 10. But one thing I wanted to bring up as we're thinking about this idea, if we're going to do what is right, if we're going to do what is good, if we're going to make good choices and do good things, we are going to have to go to the source of all that is good. And I want you to remember this passage, that phrase that Jesus used in Mark chapter 10 and verse 18, when he says, "No one is good except God alone." If we're going to determine what is right, what is good, what is bad, we have to go to God to know what those things look like. All right, Joshua chapter 10. We're going to be starting in verse 1. If you have your Bibles, so you want to follow along, you're welcome to. It says, "Now it came about when Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem." I know that's weird when you think about a king of Jerusalem whenever the Jews were not occupying Jerusalem at this time. But Jerusalem is a very old city. Whenever they conquered the land, they didn't suddenly just call it Jerusalem. Jerusalem was Jerusalem a long time ago. You may remember about a person by the name of Melchizedek, who was also king of Jerusalem many, many, many years before this whole circumstance took place. And so this gentleman, individual, is a king of Jerusalem. He heard that Joshua had captured Ai. Now, we talked about this previous lessons and looked at those passages that talk about the conquering of Ai, that great city of Ai, and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its kings, so he had done to Ai and its kings, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land. And he, that would the king, feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. Adonai-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, he's making some interesting points here. He's basically thinking to himself, and he's looking at Joshua and Israel, and he's thinking, okay, he took out Jericho. That was a powerful fortified city. He defeated Ai. That's another powerful city. But then there's the Gibeonites, right? And remember what they did. They were this deceitful group of people, and they pretended like they came from a far-off land, like they weren't part of the promised land. And so they came and they made their clothes look old and ratty, and they brought old stuff, and they showed them, and their bread was dried out, and they said, "Look at our stuff. We traveled a long ways to get here." In all reality, they were just like right next door. I mean, they were just over the hill. They weren't very far away, but they were afraid of Israel. They were afraid of Israel's God, and they tricked Israel. They pretended to not be from the land so that they can make a covenant with Israel. And so the people not consulting God, remember that was the big issue. They didn't consult God. They made a covenant with the Gibeonites, and now they're stuck in this relationship. Well, the king of Jerusalem is saying they were powerful. In fact, it causes him to pause for a moment, because he's thinking about this region made up about, I think it was 5 major cities, but we call them the Gibeonites, they were powerful, they were mighty, they were part of the royal cities of this region. They weren't anything to joke about. And now they have made a covenant with Israel, which makes all of the other regions vulnerable. And that's where the fear comes in. And so what they're going to do is they're not going to focus on the Israelites, which are the actual enemies here. They're going to start turning against their own people. They're going to turn against the Gibeonites. And so Joshua chapter 10 and verse 6, "And then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, saying, 'Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For look what he said. These are all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. Right? And so he basically, the king has rallied up all the other kings, and he's convinced them that this is a real threat. And he said, all right, we need, and really the idea is not to punish the Gibeonites. The idea is to reestablish this fortified region of their land. Because now that Israel has a covenant with the Gibeonites, it is basically put a wedge right in the middle. It is a strategic move for Israel to inhabit that land, or at least have allies in that land. And these kings know that. And so they want to reconquer this region so that they can have the upper hand, if you will. They can have this region back again and be able to have a chance, possibly, they think, of beating the Israelites. So they attack the Gibeonites, and then the Gibeonites send word to Joshua, and they basically say, hey, we're in trouble. These kings, and now they use the word all the Amorite kings. Now, I don't know if that's entirely true, but the reality is the Gibeonites have not proven themselves to be super honest people. And so they probably stretched the truth a little bit to get Joshua interested in this campaign. But that's the situation. But what was our phrase at the very beginning of this lesson? No good deed goes unpunished, right? And Joshua, at the very beginning, when we studied this, it seemed as if they felt like they were doing a good deed. They were taking these people who have traveled far, and they were going to make a holy covenant with them, which means they were going to protect them. They were going to provide for them. They were going to be as if they were their people, right? That's the kind of relationship they made with the Gibeonites. And it seemed like a good thing. It was a good deed. But not only that, when they found out that the Gibeonites had lied, Joshua chose to honor that covenant. He chose to say, despite the fact that this whole thing was built out of deception, we will honor this covenant. We will honor it. Now, granted, he says, yeah, you're going to be our servants, right? I mean, you're going to be the servants of the temple for the rest of your lives. And we talked about how 900 years later, the Gibeonites were still had that relationship with Israel. But nonetheless, we will honor that. We will not destroy you. And it was a good deed. But here's a good deed that doesn't go unpunished. Israel is going to have to deal with this situation, even though they probably didn't want to. Now, I don't know what is going through Joshua's mind. The text doesn't tell us what is going through Joshua's mind at the moment. I don't know if he took pause of the situation. I don't know if he thought about it for a minute. But as I read this story, I think to myself, this sure is a good way to get out of that covenant we made. I mean, we made a covenant. It wasn't a good one. We should have talked to God first about this, but we didn't. And now we're stuck in this relationship with the Gibeonites, and it was never a good situation. Here's a great opportunity to get out. All we have to do is stand back and watch the Amorites take over the Gibeonites, right? And then we'll just go in and we'll take out the Amorites. It would be all good. It's all going to work out. What a great plan. It's easy to think that way. It's easy to rationalize that, right? But there's something about us that we know. There's something about that relationship and relationships in general that we know that also is very true. And it's this. Two wrongs don't make a what? A right. And so, yes, was it wrong to begin with to be tricked and deceived by the Gibeonites and make a covenant without consulting God? Yes, it was wrong. Would it have been an easy out to just allow the Amorites to come down and destroy them? Yeah, it would have been easy. I mean, they could have just sat back and watched their problems go away. But it also would have been wrong. And we know that two wrongs don't make a right. There's this really interesting story as I was reading through these accounts and thinking about this that I heard years ago, and maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you're not. It happened during the 1500s, and it was about a man by the name of Dirk Williams. Now, Dirk Williams lived in a time where the prominent method for baptism was infant baptism in his area, and that's the way it was. In fact, it was the way to do things. Well, he was a proponent of adult baptism, basically what we call the believer's baptism. And he was convinced that people who are baptized out of faith, their own personal faith, not the faith of somebody else. And he persuaded many people to be what we would say rebaptized, if you will, as adults into the Christian baptism. And this belief and his vocal response to the infant baptism caused a lot of stir in the religious world. In fact, they captured him and they imprisoned him in this makeshift prison. Basically, it was a castle, if you will. And they imprisoned him for his beliefs and his unwillingness to stop preaching that particular kind of baptism. Well, he escaped. He basically took some rags and he tied them all together and he climbed out of a window. I know it's all, Hollywood style, but that's what he did. And the moat around the castle where he was imprisoned was frozen solid because it was winter. And he took opportunity of the fact that, they didn't feed him very well. So he was skinny as a rail and the ice wasn't very thick. But he took advantage of that and he took off across the ice. Well, one of the guards saw him and went after him. And by the time he got to the other side of the moat, he started hearing screaming behind him. Somebody was yelling for help. The guard had fallen right through the ice into the water. There's nobody else around, just he and the guard. And so at that moment, he had to make a choice. Could he just simply keep running and consider that a very fortunate event, right? To say, well, that does that, that takes care of that guy. And he could just keep running and he could be a free man. But he doesn't do that. Dirk Williams turns around and he goes back on the ice and he rescues the prison guard. But in the process, he himself is captured, tortured, and burned at the stake. Right? Two wrongs don't make a right. Ethics matter. Do good deeds get punished as if they were evil? Yes. Like I said before, that we cannot define what is right and what is wrong based on the response. We cannot determine what was a good decision or a bad decision based on the outcome. Some people might look at that and say, that was a terrible decision. I would imagine, having read things about Dirk Williams and things that he had done and talked about and written about, I imagine that he did not think that was a bad decision. That just because the outcome in our eyes was bad, the decision was the right one to make. And Joshua is faced with a similar kind of decision. He could have his problems dissolved away without even lifting a finger, without even sending his army. He could have his problems dissolved away. But I want you to recognize what Joshua actually does. Look at verse 7. It says, so Joshua went up to Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have handed them over to you. Not one of them will stand against you. Now, as the reader, this last passage, the last section of verse 8, is incredibly exciting. I mean, this really, a lot of the burden that we've had of the unknown, if you will, the burden and the stress we felt for Israel about the decisions they've made up to this point really have been dissolved in this interaction. As God communicates to Joshua, it's basically saying, okay, Joshua, this is the right thing to do. You're making the right decision. Not only are you making the right choice, but I will be with you. I will fight this battle with you. Go and you will have victory. That's what he's saying. So look at verse 9. So Joshua came up upon them suddenly and marching all night to Gilgal, and the Lord brought them into confusion. So he confused all of these soldiers before Israel, and he struck them down in a great defeat at Gibeon and pursued them. And as they fled from Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, the Lord hurled large stones from heaven on them as far as Zekah, and they died. Then he says, this is what the writer says, there were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. You know, we have to remember, and we talked about this at the very beginning of this series of lessons, we have to remember that these battles were not just about God giving Israel the land. That was part of it, but that wasn't the whole story. That these battles were about God's judgment against a wicked people who continue to disobey, continue to go against him, continue to do things that are contrary to God and his character. These were an evil, wicked people. And so we have to remember that a lot of these battles and these defeats involve the fact that God is exercising his righteous judgment against choices that they made. And that's part of it. And that's why we see things like this. You know, we struggle to see justice, right? I mean, that's such a hard concept to us, right? We struggle with what is right and what is wrong. We struggle with these ideas because so often what motivates us in the midst of a difficult choice are things like fear and hate, jealousy, selfishness, pride. These are human attributes, human things that cause us to make bad choices, that make it difficult to determine what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, what is just, what is fair, what is not fair. These kinds of things that we deal with, fear and hate and jealousy and selfishness and pride, the things of the flesh are not things that God deals with. God doesn't have these attributes in himself. All that he does, every choice that he makes is righteous and good. It is the right choice. And so for God to join Israel in this battle in such a way where he's not just giving Israel the strength, he's not just giving Israel soldiers the power and the strength and the might, he is actually literally joining them, throwing stones from heaven against the people. And the fact that more were killed by the hailstones and the swords of Israel tells us that this is God's righteous judgment. There's another interesting passage that came to mind as I was thinking about this. This comes from John 8, verses 3 through 11. You're probably familiar with this one as well. But it says this in verse 3 of John chapter 8. Now the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in the act of adultery. And after placing her in the center of the courtyard, they said to him would be Jesus. So they put her before Jesus. He says, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commands us to stone such a woman." Right? This is a test, right? This is a test to see what Jesus is going to do, right? Is he going to obey the law of Moses in the way they interpret it in their mind? Right? This is a test. And he says, "What do you say, Jesus? How are you going to respond?" Look at verse 6. Now, they were saying this to test him so they might have grounds of accusing him, but Jesus stooped down, and with his finger he wrote on the ground. In verse 7, when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and he said, "He who is without sin among you, let him be first to throw a stone at her." And again, he stooped down and he wrote on the ground. And now when they heard this, they began leaving one by one, beginning with the older ones. And he was left alone, and the woman where she was, in the center of the courtyard. Verse 10 says, "And standing up, Jesus said to her, 'Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?' And she said, 'No one, Lord.' And Jesus says, 'I do not condemn you either. Go from now on, do not sin any longer.'" That's our problem, isn't it? Because when we cast stones, it's usually out of fear. It's out of hatred. It's out of jealousy. It's out of selfishness. It's out of pride. Because we struggle to discern things that are right and things that are just. We struggle to determine what is right and what is wrong. But when God throws stones, you can rest assured that it is godly, righteous judgment upon a people. Look at Joshua 10 and verse 12. It says, Then Joshua spoke to the Lord on the day when the Lord turned the Amorites over to the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon at the valley of Ashalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. In verse 14, he says, There was no day like that before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. That's the good news, right? The Lord fought for Israel. But all of this whole scenario is incredible, right? We have God in heaven throwing stones in the midst of a battle. We have the sun and the moon standing still, the longest day in the Bible, right? I mean, there's all of these incredible events that take place. Not because of Israel. Israel couldn't have done this. Joshua couldn't have done this. God did this. And the text says it all happened because God was fighting with Israel. God was with them fighting their battles. You know, as Christians, it is really hard sometimes to relate to these physical battles we read about. There's a bunch of them in the Old Testament. There's a lot of situations, a lot of scenarios that we probably will never see. It is very difficult for us to relate to these physical battles of God's people in the past, because the reality is that as Christians, as God's people, we may never experience that kind of spiritual, physical battle that Israel fought. Because in all reality, we may never march in the infantry of God. We may never ride in the cavalry. We may never shoot the artillery. We may never shoot for the enemy. But we are what? In the Lord's army. That doesn't change the fact that we are still soldiers in the Lord's army. Just because we don't have that kind of experience where we put on the physical armor and draw the physical sword and go out into physical battle against physical people does not change the fact that we are still fighting in a war against evil every single day, because we are indeed a part of the Lord's army. Now, I want to read Romans chapter 8 before I make my next comments, because I think this is very telling of what I want us to hear this morning. Romans chapter 8, starting at verse 31, Paul says, If God is for us, you all know this passage, right? Who is against us? He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all. How will he not also with him freely give us all things? Who will bring charges against God's elect? God is the one who justifies. Who is the one who condemns? Christ Jesus is he who died, but rather was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. Verse 35. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will tribulation or trouble or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? Verse 36, just as it is written, For your sake we are all killed all day long. We were regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. We may not take up the physical armory of war to go against the spiritual forces of God, to be the judges that Israel was to the Amorites and those in Canaan, but we still fight a battle on a daily basis against evil. Sometimes that battle is fought against the forces that manifest themselves in trickery and deception and lies of people. who desires something of us and something through us. Maybe that's the battle that we fight. Maybe it's the temptations of this world that we struggle with, that we help each other with to overcome the evils of this world. Whatever those difficulties might be, we know that we can have the victory through Christ Jesus, our Lord. If there's anybody here this morning, maybe you're struggling with something. Maybe you're struggling with your own personal battle at the moment. Let us help you. And the best way we can help you is through prayer. Let us pray for you and encourage you. Maybe you have not become part of God's family. Maybe you have not made and committed to the covenant that God has in store for you through the act of faith in Jesus and the responsive baptism out of faith. Maybe you have not made that commitment. Whatever your needs might be this morning, if you would come forward as we stand and as we sing.